Right, so picture this. The man who now sits in number 10, sipping his morning tea and pretending to care about our brave servicemen and women, is the very same bloke who spent years making their lives an absolute nightmare. I'm not talking about a little oversight here or a minor policy disagreement there. No, no, no. We're talking about Keir Starmer actively, deliberately, systematically pushing for our veterans to be dragged through the mud with mandatory investigations for actions taken decades ago in conflict zones. The same Keir Starmer who now lays wreaths and posts solemn remembrance photos is the man who wanted every single veteran who served in Northern Ireland to potentially face prosecution. Let that sink in for a moment. The hypocrisy is so thick you could spread it on toast. If you're not already subscribed to British Mirror, smash that button right now and hit the notifications bell because we're about to expose political double-dealing that would make even the most seasoned Westminster spin doctor blush. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single revelation. Let's rewind the clock a bit, shall we? Before Starmer was busy trying to look prime ministerial, and before he was awkwardly attempting to connect with ordinary voters at carefully staged photo opportunities, he was the Director of Public Prosecutions. Powerful position that. From 2008 to 2013, he was basically the top prosecutor in England and Wales. Now, you'd think someone in that role would understand the complexities of armed conflict, the impossible decisions soldiers face in split-second moments, and the fact that warfare isn't exactly conducted under the same rules as a Sunday cricket match in the Cotswolds. But apparently, nuance wasn't on Starmer's radar back then. During his time as DPP, Starmer became absolutely obsessed with investigating British soldiers who served during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. We're talking about events from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, decades-old cases. These veterans had served their country, come home, tried to build normal lives, raised families, and were getting on with their retirement when suddenly, knock knock, here comes Keir Starmer's prosecutorial machine, ready to dredge up the past and put them through the legal wringer. The stress, the anxiety, the financial burden, the sleepless nights wondering if you're going to spend your twilight years in prison for following orders in a conflict zone? Apparently, that was all perfectly acceptable collateral damage in Starmer's quest for what he called justice. But here's where it gets properly mental. Starmer didn't just support investigations on a case-by-case basis where there was compelling new evidence. Oh no, he pushed for mandatory, systematic investigations. Mandatory. That means every incident, every allegation, no matter how old, no matter how thoroughly it had already been examined, would automatically trigger a formal investigation. Imagine being a 75-year-old veteran who served in Belfast, did your duty, came home, and now you're facing interrogation for something that happened when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. The psychological torture alone is staggering. Now let's contrast that with how the IRA terrorists were treated, shall we? Because this is where the blood truly boils. While British veterans were being hunted down with the enthusiasm of a detective solving a fresh murder case, actual IRA members who planted bombs, murdered civilians, and terrorized communities were benefiting from the Good Friday Agreement's early release schemes. They got letters of comfort, they got amnesty, they got to walk free and live peaceful lives. But Tommy from Birmingham, who was 19 years old when he was sent to patrol the streets of Londonderry, he gets a knock on the door 40 years later, and the full weight of the British legal system breathing down his neck. The asymmetry is absolutely obscene. Starmer's defenders will tell you he was just doing his job, following the law, ensuring accountability. Brilliant, lovely, except the law isn't supposed to be wielded like a blunt instrument against the very people who risked their lives defending it. There's a reason we have statutes of limitations for most crimes. There's a reason we recognize that justice delayed is justice denied. There's a reason we understand that traumatized young soldiers making split-second decisions in active conflict zones aren't the same as premeditated criminals. But apparently, these basic principles of fairness didn't apply when Starmer was running the show.
The Northern Ireland veterans movement has been shouting about this for years. These aren't political activists or partisan hacks. These are former servicemen and women, their families, and their advocates who watched in horror as witch hunts masquerading as investigations destroyed lives. Veterans in their 70s and 80s were being arrested, questioned, and prosecuted. The mental health crisis among these veterans has been well documented. Depression, PTSD made worse by the investigations, marriages falling apart, suicides, real consequences for real people. But did Starmer care? Well, he certainly wasn't backing down from his mandatory investigation crusade. Here's a particularly delicious bit of irony that'll make your head spin. Fast forward to Starmer's time as Labour leader and then as Prime Minister, and suddenly he's all about supporting our armed forces. The photo ops at military bases, the carefully crafted statements on Armed Forces Day, the solemn nods during remembrance ceremonies. He's practically wrapped himself in the Union Jack and salutes anything that moves. The transformation from prosecutor-in-chief of veterans to their supposed champion is so dramatic it deserves a BAFTA for best performance in a political role. But veterans aren't stupid. They remember. They know exactly who Keir Starmer is and what he stood for when he had the power to make their lives miserable. You can't simply rebrand yourself and expect people to forget that you spent years treating them like war criminals. It's like a vegetarian suddenly opening a butcher shop and expecting everyone to believe they've always loved a good Sunday roast. The credibility just isn't there. The legislation that finally gave veterans some protection, the Overseas Operations Act in 2021, provided a degree of legal protection for service personnel by introducing a presumption against prosecution for historical allegations. Guess who opposed it? Go on, have a guess. That's right, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. They voted against protecting veterans from these very prosecutions. Labour's argument was that it could allow war crimes to go unpunished. Noble concern, except we're not talking about actual war crimes here. We're talking about soldiers who followed rules of engagement in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, often as teenagers, being prosecuted decades later based on flimsy or politically motivated allegations. The cognitive dissonance required to oppose veteran protections and then turn around and claim you support the troops is genuinely impressive. It's the political equivalent of saying you love animals while simultaneously running a butcher shop. The two positions are fundamentally incompatible, but Starmer seems to think the British public has the memory of a goldfish. What makes this even more galling is the selective nature of Starmer's prosecutorial enthusiasm. While he was happy to throw the book at British veterans, where was this same zealous pursuit of justice for other historical wrongs? Where were the mandatory investigations into corporate malfeasance, into financial crimes that collapsed the economy, into the various scandals that have plagued British public life? Funny how that mandatory approach seemed to apply primarily to elderly veterans rather than, say, wealthy and powerful individuals who might have the resources to fight back. The veterans who served in Northern Ireland weren't there on holiday. They were sent by the British government to deal with one of the most complex, dangerous, and politically sensitive conflicts in modern British history. They were often young, poorly trained for counterinsurgency, and thrown into situations where distinguishing between civilians and combatants was nearly impossible. They operated under strict rules of engagement, knowing that any mistake could end their career or land them in prison. They watched their mates get blown up by IRA bombs. They saw the aftermath of terrorist attacks on innocent civilians. And then, decades later, they got to relive all that trauma in interview rooms while Starmer's prosecutors picked apart their memories of events from half a century ago. The message this sends to current and future service personnel is absolutely chilling. Why would anyone sign up to serve their country, knowing that decades down the line, some ambitious prosecutor or politician might decide to make an example of you? Why would you put your life on the line when the very government you're serving might throw you under the bus to score political points or appear progressive? It's a betrayal of the military covenant, that unspoken agreement between the nation and those who serve it. We ask them to do difficult, dangerous things on our behalf, and in return, we promise to support them. Starmer's mandatory investigation policy shattered that covenant. And let's talk about the actual outcomes of these investigations, shall we? Because after all the stress, all the legal fees, all the media coverage painting veterans as potential war criminals, how many resulted in convictions? Precious few. Turns out that when you try to prosecute someone for events that happened 40 or 50 years ago, based on witness testimony that's inevitably unreliable after so much time, with incomplete records and no physical evidence, you don't get many convictions. Who could have possibly predicted that? Oh wait, everyone except Keir Starmer apparently. So we put veterans through years of hell, destroyed their mental health, bankrupted some of them with legal costs, all for investigations that were always going to go nowhere. Brilliant use of resources, that. The political calculation here is so transparent, it's almost insulting. When Starmer was DPP and eyeing a political career, going after British veterans for alleged crimes in Northern Ireland probably seemed like a progressive, principled stance. It played well with certain crowds, made him look tough and uncompromising on accountability. But now that he's actually got to win elections and govern, suddenly those same veterans are people he needs to pretend to support. The principles disappeared the moment they became politically inconvenient. If that's not betrayal, I don't know what is. What makes this even more frustrating is the selective nature of Starmer's prosecutorial enthusiasm. While he was happy to throw the book at British veterans, where was this same zealous pursuit of justice for other historical wrongs? Where were the mandatory investigations into corporate malfeasance